Fame builds walls, but sometimes it builds a target. He was the most admired man on earth, the hero who conquered the Atlantic, and in 1932, the walls around his piece became the scene of America's darkest hour. A quiet home in Hopewell, New Jersey, a child asleep, a ladder against the window. Then by morning, silence that reached the entire world. What followed wasn't just a crime, it was a psychological mirror, showing a nation what fear looks like when innocence disappears. For 3 years, thousands chased one shadow through money, handwriting, and wood grain. Every clue led deeper, not only into the mind of a killer, but into the birth of the modern idea of justice. A carpenter in the Bronx, a ladder built from his own attic. A courtroom turned into theater, and a verdict that split history in half, between what was proven and what was simply believed. Because this wasn't just the kidnapping of a child, it was the moment America learned that truth could be built, like evidence, piece by piece, until no one dared question the shape it made. The winter of 1932 lingered over the hills of central New Jersey, where the Lindbergh estate stood isolated among rolling fields and leafless trees. The property, covering nearly 400 acres outside the small town of Hopewell, had been designed for quiet living. It was not a grand mansion by the standards of the rich, but a stone and timber house, built with simplicity, far from the public eyes that had followed Charles Lindbergh since his solo flight across the Atlantic 5 years earlier. Here he and his wife Anne sought privacy, the chance to raise their young son away from the press and the endless parade of admirers who saw the aviator not as a man, but as a symbol. The house was meant to be a refuge. Its stillness, however, would not last. By late February, workmen had nearly finished the grounds. The drive was long and lined with small evergreens. Inside, the rooms were sparse and practical, reflecting Lindbergh's preference for function over display. The nursery occupied the second floor, a bright space with a single window facing the woods. It was prepared with care for the couple's first child, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., then 20 months old. Each evening, Nurse Betty Gow followed the same pattern. A bath, a clean sleeping suit, and lights out by 9. Downstairs, the household staff closed the day quietly, and the Lindberghs settled into their routine. The estate felt secure, surrounded by open land and distant neighbors. No one imagined it could be reached unseen. Outside the walls of the property, America was restless. The Great Depression had deepened, leaving cities choked with unemployment and desperation. Crime had taken on new dimensions. Bank robberies, ransom plots, and organized gangs now filled the headlines that had once celebrated Lindbergh's flight. The same fame that had made him a hero now made him vulnerable. Newspapers printed photographs of his home and family. Reporters tracked his movements. He was a household name, whose fortune, however modest, symbolized stability in a crumbling nation. To those inclined toward crime, the name Lindbergh meant opportunity. On the evening of Tuesday, March 1st, 1932, the household prepared for another quiet night. A cold wind moved across the fields, carrying with it the faint sounds of the nearby Sourland Mountains. Anne Lindbergh was unwell and remained in bed. The baby, recovering from a slight cold, slept upstairs in his crib. Colonel Lindbergh worked in his study, planning a new aircraft design. The servants had retired to their quarters, and by 9 o'clock the house was nearly silent. From the outside, only a few lights glowed faintly through the drawn shades. Somewhere beyond the trees, an intruder began to move through the darkness. Investigators would later reconstruct the path. A figure crossing the field from the north, carrying a 2-section ladder that had been sawed and assembled by hand. The ground was soft from rain, and prints were left in the mud, though they were faint and unmeasurable. The person reached the house from the east, where a narrow clearing met the wall beneath the nursery window. The ladder was placed carefully against the sill. In the still air of that night, the creak of wood might have gone unnoticed. No one inside heard the ascent. The window was opened, the latch forced, and within minutes, the child was gone. At 10 p.m., Betty Gow climbed the stairs to check on the baby. The crib was empty. She searched the room twice before running to alert the parents. Lindbergh moved quickly through the house, calling for lights, scanning the yard with a flashlight. The nursery window was open, and on its sill lay a single envelope, crudely folded, with uneven handwriting on its face. It demanded $50,000 for the child's return. Beneath the window, the ladder lay in 2 broken pieces, where the middle section had split under strain. On the floor inside the nursery, there were mud smudges, marks of a shoe that had stepped carefully, but left faint traces of soil. No blood, no fingerprints, nothing else. The Hopewell police arrived within the hour, followed by reporters who had heard the first whispers of the event over the telephone wires. Within minutes, what began as a local alarm became a national story. Searchers spread across the grounds with lanterns, combing the woods, the barn, the creek bed. Officers found footprints leading into the dark but could not measure them. Dogs were brought in and lost the scent near the road. The estate's gates were closed, but the damage was done. In a single night, the most admired family in America had been struck by a crime that would soon dominate the nation's conscience. By midnight, Colonel H. Norman Schwarzkopf, superintendent of the New Jersey State Police, took charge. He ordered guards around the property and established a command post in the house. The FBI, then still the Bureau of Investigation, had no jurisdiction, but Director J. Edgar Hoover immediately offered cooperation. Within hours, agents in New York and Washington were placed on standby. The case was already being compared to an act of national assault. Newspapers prepared morning editions before dawn, and the word kidnapping was on every front page by sunrise. The ransom note became the first piece of hard evidence. Its writing was awkward, the letters uneven, and filled with errors. The demand was clear: $50,000 in small bills, to be delivered under instructions that would follow. At the bottom was a strange symbol, a pair of intersecting circles, and red marks that would appear on every subsequent message. Experts determined that the note had been written by someone of German origin, based on syntax and misspelling, but no fingerprints were recovered. Only the paper, the ink, and the coded emblem. While the police organized their perimeter, Lindbergh's connections reached far beyond official channels. Friends in law enforcement, private investigators, and even criminal intermediaries were contacted to seek leads. In those first days, the case produced more confusion than clarity. Hundreds of supposed clues were reported: strange cars near the estate, men asking questions about Lindbergh's son, rumors of organized gangs planning abductions. None of them held. The case expanded rapidly, crossing state lines as letters and telegrams flooded Hopewell. The FBI's New York field office monitored the situation closely, acting as a liaison, but without authority to intervene directly. By March 6, a second ransom note, postmarked Brooklyn, arrived at the Lindbergh home. The demand had increased to $70,000, and the writer's tone was more threatening. A police conference convened in Trenton, bringing together state, local, and federal representatives to coordinate efforts. Among them was Colonel Schwarzkopf, who would lead the field operations, and Colonel Henry Breckinridge, Lindbergh's attorney, who began to oversee private negotiations. Their challenge was immense: maintain communication with potential kidnappers, while controlling the flood of false information from opportunists seeking money or fame. Over the following week, the case drew volunteers and intruders alike. Reporters camped outside the estate. Spectators arrived by car, clogging nearby roads in hopes of catching a glimpse of the investigation. The ransom notes continued, each written in the same clumsy hand, each bearing the same symbol. The kidnappers seemed aware of every public statement. Police suspected that someone in the area was watching the investigation closely. The search radius widened across New Jersey and New York, but still no credible suspect emerged. Within days, the media had transformed the tragedy into spectacle. The name Lindbergh had once symbolized triumph. The young pilot who conquered the Atlantic. Now it symbolized vulnerability. The kidnapping of his child was seen as an assault on the American ideal of family security. Donations poured in, rewards were offered, and every possible lead was publicized. Yet with each new headline, the case grew murkier. The true kidnappers remained silent except through their notes. The house in Hopewell, once a private retreat, had become the command center of one of the largest manhunts in history. Amid the chaos, forensic work began in earnest. The latter, collected in 3 sections, was sent to laboratories for examination. Investigators noted that the wood was hand-planed, the nails of varying size, and the joints uneven but deliberate. It was a makeshift tool built by someone who understood carpentry, likely using scrap wood from multiple sources. Each section was numbered and photographed, and fragments were stored as evidence. The handwriting from the notes was analyzed by experts, who concluded that all letters had been written by the same individual, educated but foreign, precise yet careless. These clues, fragile as they were, became the foundation for what would follow. Inside the Lindbergh home, life moved in slow motion. The nursery was sealed off, the crib empty, the walls marked for fingerprint dusting. Officers rotated shifts guarding the property. Reporters continued to circle outside the gates, photographing every visitor. Within law enforcement circles, the case forced cooperation on an unprecedented scale. The FBI's offer of technical aid led to the exchange of information between federal and state investigators. It was one of the earliest examples of coordinated interagency investigation, a structure that would later become standard in major crimes. In the days that followed, underworld figures began offering assistance. Some sought money, others sought redemption. Every rumor was chased: gangs in Detroit, kidnappers in the Bronx, escaped convicts, even organized bootleg networks. The search spread as far as Chicago and St. Louis. At the same time, ransom negotiations intensified through intermediaries. Each message from the kidnappers demanded patience and warned against police interference. Each carried new instructions, new numbers, new conditions. The pressure on Lindbergh grew unbearable, and still there was no trace of his son. Behind the scenes, J. Edgar Hoover maintained steady communication with Schwarzkopf. Though the Bureau lacked authority, Hoover ordered his New York field agents to provide whatever technical and logistical assistance they could. Agents compiled background reports, cross-checked suspects, and distributed lists of known forgers and kidnappers. The Bureau's early forensic analysts examined the handwriting samples sent from New Jersey, cataloging letter shapes and pressure patterns. Their reports described a unique slant and formation, consistent across every note, a signature that would later become crucial evidence. By mid-March, the number of false leads exceeded 1,000. Tips came from across the country. Some claimed the child had been seen in Pennsylvania, others in Maryland or New York. None were verified. The Ransom correspondence continued, now involving Dr. John F. Condon, the retired Bronx educator who had offered through a local newspaper to act as intermediary. His involvement, though not yet publicly known, marked a turning point. Condon's willingness to communicate directly with the kidnappers would soon provide investigators with their first consistent point of contact. But in the early days of March, that development still lay ahead. In those weeks, the Hopewell estate remained under constant watch. Guards patrolled the grounds nightly, lanterns cutting through the mist. Inside, investigators pored over maps comparing footprints, wood types, and vehicle tracks. The sense of control was slipping. The case was becoming larger than any one agency could contain. Across the nation, families checked their own locks at night. The kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby was no longer a private tragedy. It was a collective fear, magnified by headlines and radio broadcasts that reached every household in America. Meanwhile, small but telling discoveries emerged. Near the estate's entrance, a thumb guard, the type the child had worn at bedtime, was found in the mud on March 29, nearly 4 weeks after the abduction. It confirmed that the kidnapper had carried the child down the ladder. Yet the trail ended there. Beyond the road, the footprints vanished. The isolated position of the house, the darkness of the countryside, and the lack of witnesses had erased every trace of escape. For all the manpower devoted to the search, the investigation remained blind. By the end of March, frustration had set in. State troopers rotated out, new ones arrived, and private investigators began to compete with official ones. Rumors of ransom intermediaries filled the papers. The Lindberghs endured a constant parade of officials, reporters, and opportunists. The handwriting analysis pointed only to a foreign origin. The latter evidence pointed to a carpenter. The geography pointed to someone familiar with rural New Jersey. Yet none of these clues converged on a name. The first month of the investigation closed with no resolution. The nation's first celebrity crime had exposed the weaknesses of law enforcement coordination. It also revealed the psychological toll of fame in a country desperate for stability. What had begun as a single abduction was evolving into a test of the entire justice system's capacity to handle organized crime, forensic science, and public hysteria. Inside the Bureau of Investigation's files, the case was already labeled as one of national importance, though no one yet understood how far it would reach. By early April, the exchange with the kidnappers through Condon would begin. The ransom payment would be made. The trail would stretch from Hopewell to the Bronx, from muddy fields to shadowed cemeteries. But on the night of March 1st, none of that was yet written. The house on the hill remained a crime scene locked in silence, its nursery window open to the wind. The child was gone. The note lay folded on the sill, and the first great modern manhunt in American history had begun. The child was gone. The note lay folded on the sill, and the first great modern manhunt in American history had begun. Within minutes, the stillness of the Lindbergh estate broke apart into frantic motion. Lanterns flared across the yard as household staff searched every corner of the property, their lights moving through the night like beacons over the dark field. Colonel Lindbergh's flashlight beam swept along the ground, tracing the faint impressions of footprints that vanished near the tree line. The sound of boots and voices carried into the cold air as the first police officers from Hopewell arrived, their cars jolting to a stop on the gravel road. The entire estate, once a symbol of security, had turned into a confined arena of panic. Officers fanned out in widening circles, calling for silence while they searched. Their eyes fell on the crude ladder at the base of the wall. 2 broken sections, mud-streaked, one joint split under weight. It was evidence of a climb, evidence of an escape, and the only physical link between the house and the darkness beyond. Inside the nursery, investigators moved carefully. The open window let in a steady chill, and the scent of fresh mud hung in the air. The crib stood empty, the bedding undisturbed, except for a single indentation where the child's body had rested. On the floor, faint marks of shoe soles crossed the wood, smudges leading toward the window. No fingerprints appeared on the sill, the walls, or the note itself. The paper was folded twice, written in uneven, foreign handwriting. The words demanded $50,000 and warned against police involvement. The symbol drawn beneath, a pair of intersecting circles, red marks in their center, was unlike anything the officers had seen. They sealed the envelope in a bag and turned to the ladder once more, unsure what to make of the crude construction. The crime had been executed with precision and speed, but the materials suggested improvisation. Whoever had planned this knew exactly where to enter, how to move unseen, and when the house would be quiet. By midnight, the New Jersey State Police had assumed control. Colonel H. Norman Schwarzkopf, a disciplined officer with a reputation for method, arrived from Trenton with a team of troopers. The estate became a command post, telephones installed, floodlights mounted, guards stationed along the roads. News spread faster than any order could contain it. Reporters converged on Hopewell, their cars lining the narrow lane that led to the Lindbergh property. By dawn, the world already knew. The kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby had turned from a local emergency into a national crisis. That morning, dozens of officials gathered in the main hall. Lindbergh stood silent as Schwarzkopf outlined procedures. Every road leading from the estate would be patrolled, every vehicle noted, every visitor screened. A perimeter was drawn, though it was meaningless against the tide of reporters and onlookers who had already begun to arrive. Within 24 hours, the case had attracted hundreds of tips, each promising knowledge, none providing proof. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, at that moment still known as the Bureau of Investigation, could offer only assistance. Director J. Edgar Hoover telephoned Schwarzkopf to pledge cooperation, but under federal law, kidnapping was still a state offense. The Bureau would act as liaison and clearinghouse, collecting information but lacking authority to arrest. It would be months before legislation gave them the power such crimes demanded. The Hopewell house became a fortress of confusion. Investigators moved through it methodically, photographing every angle of the nursery, dusting the windows for prints, labeling fragments of the latter. Officers interviewed each servant, mapping their movements throughout the night. None had seen or heard anything unusual. The nurse, Betty Gow, repeated her timeline again and again. She had checked the child at 9, heard nothing until 10, then found the crib empty. The cook had been cleaning downstairs, the butler in his quarters, the chauffeur off duty. The estate's isolation, once its greatest virtue, had now ensured that no witness existed. Even the neighbors, separated by acres of woodland, had heard nothing but wind. Through the next 48 hours, the operation expanded. The first ransom note was examined under magnification by handwriting experts, who concluded that the writer was likely of German nationality and had some familiarity with English. Linguistic quirks suggested formal schooling abroad. The note's paper was common, the ink ordinary, and no fingerprints appeared. That absence only deepened suspicion that the perpetrator was experienced. Photostatic copies were distributed to investigative offices in New York, Trenton, and Philadelphia. The Bureau cataloged the document, noting every peculiar stroke of pen and shape of letter. Hoover's agents, though confined to an auxiliary role, began their own analysis in Washington, treating the note as a forensic artifact, rather than a mere message. Outside, the press corps multiplied. Journalists camped along the road, photographing anyone who entered or left. The story consumed every major newspaper in the country. Americans who had celebrated Lindbergh's transatlantic triumph now watched his anguish from afar. The case had no precedent. A national hero's child taken from his home. The ransom note left in plain sight. The kidnappers unseen. It was both personal tragedy and public drama, and within days it dominated every radio broadcast. Public sympathy flooded toward the family, but so did a wave of opportunists, men who claimed underworld connections, self-proclaimed detectives, and frauds who mailed letters promising the child's return for a fee. Each had to be examined, and each proved false. On March 4th, a second ransom note, postmarked Brooklyn, arrived. The demand rose to $70,000. The tone was more direct, the handwriting identical. It confirmed what the first note had implied, that the kidnappers were organized, cautious, and watching every development. The letter reignited the investigation, drawing attention away from rural New Jersey to the boroughs of New York. The New York City Police Department, working with Schwarzkopf's troopers, began tracing potential suspects among known forgers, extortionists, and gang associates with German backgrounds. Lists grew long, reports thicker, and still nothing pointed to the child. Governor A. Harry Moore called a meeting at Trenton to coordinate the state's response. Prosecutors, police chiefs, and federal representatives filled the room. Each department presented theories: itinerant laborers, professional gang kidnappers, foreign nationals. Colonel Schwarzkopf listened, taking notes but offering no speculation. His focus remained on procedure, tracking ransom communication, monitoring correspondence, preserving evidence. The conference produced little more than agreement to share information. Still, its formation marked one of the first attempts at multi-agency cooperation in a major American crime. The FBI's presence there, unofficial yet influential, foreshadowed its future authority. By March 5, Lindbergh's friends had begun to receive letters from supposed kidnappers offering to negotiate. Each was tested, each exposed as fraud. In an effort to break the impasse, Colonel Henry Breckinridge, Lindbergh's attorney, began working privately with intermediaries. Underworld channels were explored, with known gangsters questioned quietly in New York and Chicago. Even Al Capone, imprisoned in Atlanta, publicly offered assistance through his lawyers. The case had reached a level of spectacle unmatched in law enforcement history. On the estate, days turned into a pattern of arrival and departure. Police vehicles, reporters, volunteers. The once secluded home now resembled a military base. Investigators revisited the ladder, measuring each piece, cataloging its construction. They noted a split, where two sections had joined, evidence of stress during descent. The nails were irregular, the joints not professionally cut, but built with purpose. The wood was white pine and fir, materials available from local yards. These details, recorded meticulously, would one day trace back to a single carpenter. But in 1932, they offered only conjecture. Each night, as search parties swept the woods with flashlights, the house behind them remained unchanged. A crib empty, a note locked in evidence, and a family waiting. On March 6, the investigation expanded to include every known kidnap for ransom case in the previous decade. The Bureau compiled comparative files. Methods of entry, types of notes, ransom language, patterns emerged but none matched precisely. The crime's mixture of sophistication and crudity baffled analysts. The handwriting betrayed intelligence. The ladder and footprints suggested improvisation. The absence of accomplice chatter in criminal circles implied secrecy. Whoever committed this act had planned for months and trusted no one beyond themselves. Through March 7 and 8, correspondence continued. More notes followed, each confirming the kidnapper's command of the situation. By March 8, Lindbergh's attorney received the third ransom note, stating that the family's chosen intermediary would not be accepted. The writer demanded a newspaper advertisement to establish contact. The instructions were specific, and the tone dismissive of police efforts. That same day, a Bronx resident named Dr. John F. Condon, a retired school principal, published an offer in the Bronx Home News to serve as a go-between. He pledged to add $1,000 of his own to the ransom. His notice appeared under the signature Jafsie, a coded contraction of his initials. Within 48 hours, Condon received a letter acknowledging his proposal. It was the fourth ransom note, sent directly to his address, written in the same hand, bearing the same symbol. For the first time, the kidnappers had responded to a civilian rather than law enforcement. This moment shifted the direction of the case. Through Condon, the kidnappers had found a controllable link. Lindbergh approved his role, hoping any lead might restore his son. The police, though skeptical, agreed to monitor from a distance. What had begun as a straightforward ransom plot was becoming a prolonged negotiation between unseen adversaries. Each letter carried new demands and coded references. Each line was analyzed by linguists and handwriting experts who sought hints of identity. The Bureau's Washington laboratory compiled reproductions, noting identical pen pressure and idiosyncratic spellings. Money is ready, we warn you. The pattern was unmistakable. A single hand guided every note. The household's daily rhythm dissolved into investigative procedure. Mail was opened under supervision. Phone calls recorded. Vehicles logged. At the same time, Schwarzkopf's men canvassed nearby towns, inspecting lumberyards and hardware stores for wood similar to the latter. They questioned carpenters, builders, and anyone with access to white pine in the previous months. Yet Hopewell remained a void. No strangers seen, no vehicles identified, no witnesses forthcoming. The countryside, that had promised anonymity, now hindered every effort to trace the intruder's path. The road into the estate curved through fields, where tire tracks vanished overnight, under frost. Each morning, troopers measured them again, hoping for something new. Each morning, nothing changed. By the second week of March, Dr. Condon's correspondence had transformed the case into an elaborate game of coded messages. Through newspaper ads and mailed replies, he attempted to establish trust with the kidnappers. His letters were filled with reassurances, their responses with commands. Meanwhile, the original investigation continued to expand in scope. The FBI in New York circulated serial numbers of the ransom bills to banks, instructing tellers to watch for any appearance of gold certificates, matching those to be used in payment. The idea was simple but ambitious: to make the ransom itself traceable, long after the exchange. This tactic would later become the foundation for the Bureau's success. But in March 1932, it was only a contingency. In Hopewell, weeks passed with no sign of the child. The press began to speculate, the public to despair. The Lindberghs endured their grief in silence, while investigators worked around them. The nursery, once filled with sound, remained sealed. Patrols circled the property at night. Beyond its fences, America watched. The kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby had evolved from crime into national obsession. It revealed the limits of law enforcement in a modern age: fragmented jurisdictions, conflicting methods, and public pressure beyond measure. Yet even in the confusion, groundwork was being laid. The first forensic coordination between state police and the Bureau. The first systematic tracing of ransom money. The first glimmer of the investigative discipline that would one day define the FBI. By the end of March, with the ransom negotiations underway and the search still fruitless, the case stood on the edge of escalation. Every officer, every agent, and every journalist understood that the next discovery, another note, a clue, or a body, would alter the direction of history. For now, there was only waiting. The footprints had faded, the ladder was locked in evidence, and the first note, crude and cold, lay preserved in an envelope under police guard. It was the beginning of a long descent into one of the most exhaustive criminal investigations America had ever known. Within days, the search that had begun on the quiet slopes of Hopewell expanded far beyond the borders of New Jersey. Police departments, private detectives, and federal agents moved simultaneously, their efforts converging in an atmosphere of national panic. Each morning brought new reports, new rumors, and new failures. The name Lindbergh had ceased to signify flight and courage. It now meant loss. The press printed his photograph beside the empty crib, the ransom note, and the ladder. To millions of Americans, the crime had become personal, a violation of the nation's sense of safety during a time when little security remained. By mid-March, state troopers had combed miles of countryside surrounding the estate. Farmhouses were questioned, barns inspected, rivers dragged. No trace of the missing child appeared. The absence of evidence was as defining as any discovery. It indicated planning, control, and a perpetrator who understood how to erase a trail. What investigators lacked in clues, they compensated for with manpower. The headquarters at Hopewell became a continuous command center, maps covering the walls, telephones ringing without pause. From Washington, Director Hoover's bureau maintained silent observation, gathering copies of every report, every photograph, every note. The agent's handwriting analyses, wood examinations, and procedural memoranda filled hundreds of pages that would in time evolve into the first complete forensic archive of a major crime. Meanwhile, the Ransom correspondence through Dr. Condon deepened. The retired Bronx educator had stepped willingly into the kidnapper's design, placing newspaper advertisements under his code name, Jafsie. The exchanges arrived with uncanny precision, each letter postmarked from New York, each repeating the same emblem of interlocked circles. Their author appeared to monitor every public development. When police intensified patrols, the tone hardened. When Condon's messages pleaded for mercy, the next note responded as if mocking compassion. The letters, copied and analyzed, showed consistency of ink, pen pressure, and phrasing that suggested a single writer operating from within the metropolitan area. Yet despite surveillance of post offices and the tracing of handwriting samples, the source remained invisible. As correspondence continued, the case transformed from abduction into a siege of communication. Reporters printed daily updates on each letter, dissecting their content with the same intensity as investigators. Radio commentators described the wording as though it were scripture to be interpreted. The more the nation listened, the less anyone actually saw. The kidnapper's anonymity became part of their power. They dictated not only the ransom, but the pace of the entire investigation. Colonel Schwarzkopf fought to maintain discipline among his men as speculation consumed the command post. Every night, mailbags of new tips arrived from across the country, claims of sightings, confessions, and coded messages from self-appointed prophets. Most were dismissed, but every scrap had to be read, cataloged, and filed. On March 12th, the promised exchange finally occurred. Following a chain of instructions, delivered through notes left at designated points, Condon met the man he knew as John, inside the dark expanse of Woodlawn Cemetery. No one else saw the figure clearly, but Condon's later description would be precise: medium height, stocky build, foreign accent, cautious movements. In the gloom, ransom money packed into small bundles changed hands. In return, Condon received the 13th note, directions claiming that the child could be found aboard a boat named Nellie, near Martha's Vineyard. The transaction completed, the stranger vanished among the trees. When searchers reached the coast 2 days later, they found nothing. There was no boat, no crew, no sign of life. The money was gone, and the promise had been false. The impact on the investigation was immediate. With the ransom delivered, and the child still missing, public fury replaced sympathy. Newspapers accused the police of failure, the Bureau of passivity, and the Lindberghs of naivety. Letters to the editor demanded federal control. In response, President Herbert Hoover authorized every investigative branch of government to assist the New Jersey authorities. Though no federal kidnapping statute yet existed, the Bureau of Investigation was formally designated as clearinghouse and coordinator for all related inquiries. It was a critical precedent, an acknowledgement that state boundaries could no longer contain modern crime. From that moment, coordination became the defining feature of the case. Agents from the Bureau, state troopers, postal inspectors, and New York detectives pooled information daily. Lists of serial numbers from the ransom bills circulated through banks nationwide. Pamphlets printed by the Bureau detailed the denominations, series, and markings of every note. Cashiers and tellers were instructed to inspect all currency, particularly gold certificates. The goal was not immediate recovery, but patient vigilance. The belief that money once spent would betray its holder. In March 1932, this was revolutionary thinking. The tracing of ransom currency would later become standard procedure in extortion cases. But here it began as an improvised tactic born of desperation. While the federal machinery turned, the atmosphere in Hopewell darkened. The estate remained under constant guard, its gates watched by uniformed officers. Inside, silence prevailed. Each day, Anne Lindbergh wrote brief notes in her journal, recording small details: the weather, the movement of police, the sound of engines on the distant road. Charles Lindbergh spent his hours coordinating with Schwarzkopf, driving to Trenton, studying maps. The investigation had taken over every corner of their lives. The walls that had once promised refuge now echoed with footsteps of strangers, cataloging grief. Reporters still gathered outside the perimeter fence, photographing shadows that moved behind curtained windows. As March lengthened, the case's complexity multiplied. New ransom notes appeared, their postmarks shifting from Brooklyn to the Bronx. Each contained reminders that the child was alive, and warnings against deception. Yet the handwriting, though identical, began to show subtle variations: pressure marks, letter height, stroke direction. The handwriting experts debated as signs of physical strain or intentional disguise. The Bureau's laboratory documented every change. At the same time, the wooden ladder was re-examined by the State Police Laboratory. Splinters were preserved, grain patterns sketched, tool marks charted. Unknown to investigators then, one of the ladder rails contained nail holes that would later align perfectly with boards missing from a Bronx attic. For now, it remained only another unexplained artifact in a growing collection of evidence without connection. Across the nation, the Lindbergh kidnapping eclipsed every other story. Congress debated resolutions on crime. Newspapers printed editorials describing a country held hostage by fear. Citizens organized volunteer search parties, while fortune tellers and self-proclaimed clairvoyants mailed visions to the authorities. Telephones at Hopewell rang endlessly. The public, deprived of certainty during the Depression, found in the case a grim form of unity. Each household followed developments, as if the missing child belonged to them all. In Washington, Hoover recognized that the Bureau's reputation would hinge on its conduct. He ordered absolute discipline in every report and forbade speculation. Agents documented procedure, cataloged evidence, and built a model of systematic investigation that contrasted sharply with the rumor-driven frenzy outside. Their professionalism slowly began to influence state operations. Coordination meetings replaced mass briefings. Evidence was centralized, redundancies reduced. The structure of federal investigative cooperation that would later define the modern FBI was in essence built from the architecture of the Lindbergh search. As weeks passed with no resolution, morale among field officers eroded. Detectives who had promised swift results now faced an invisible adversary. On March 29, a grim discovery reignited movement. Betty Gow found a small thumb guard, part of the sleeping outfit the baby had worn, lying in the mud near the estate's entrance. It proved that the abductor had carried the child down the ladder and across the grounds. The clue renewed searches of every path leading from the property. But again, the trail ended at the road. No one could determine whether the perpetrator had fled on foot, by automobile, or with an accomplice waiting nearby. Every possibility remained open, and every one led nowhere. During these final days of March, correspondence continued between Condon and the kidnappers. The retired school teacher, acting on instinct rather than authority, persisted in publishing coded messages, offering reassurance and requesting proof of life. Each reply he received demanded renewed payment or silence. His involvement, though irregular, became indispensable. He was the only thread connecting investigators to the perpetrators. Yet his role also invited risk. Newspapers, desperate for novelty, discovered his identity and publicized his efforts, giving the kidnappers unwanted visibility. The Bureau feared the exposure would end communication altogether. For a time it did. Then, as if testing the boundaries of control, another letter arrived, again postmarked from the Bronx, reiterating that the child was safe, and that patience would bring results. By the close of March 1932, the national mood had changed from grief to anger. Politicians demanded accountability. The press blamed conflicting jurisdictions. The state police defended their methods. The Bureau defended its restraint. Every institution involved had something to lose if the case remained unsolved. In this climate, the pursuit of the kidnappers evolved into a pursuit of efficiency itself, a competition between local tradition and emerging federal science. Each department sought to prove superiority, and the Lindbergh tragedy became the stage upon which modern American law enforcement would define its future. Inside the Bureau, analysts summarized progress. The handwriting evidence suggested one man. The latter indicated a craftsman with mechanical skill. The ransom notes implied knowledge of the family's routine. Together, these fragments described a suspect who was intelligent, patient, and capable of precise planning. Yet without a name or sighting, theory held no weight. Every file returned to the same conclusion. The only hope of discovery lay in the money. Somewhere, someday, the ransom bills would surface. And when they did, the handwriting, the wood, and the symbols would finally converge. For now, the Bureau waited, the state police searched, and the public speculated. The Lindbergh estate remained sealed, a monument to unanswered questions. The investigation, born in panic, had transformed into a test of endurance, measured not in days, but in months. As March gave way to April, the United States, still mired in economic depression, still clinging to the myth of its heroes, found itself bound together by a single unsolved crime. The child had vanished, the ransom had been paid, and the nation itself was learning the price of certainty. In the weeks that followed, the investigation's center of gravity shifted from the silent estate in New Jersey to the dense neighborhoods of the Bronx. The ransom money had vanished. The child had not been found, and yet the letters continued to arrive, each carrying the same emblem of red inked circles, each written in the same hesitant, foreign hand. The kidnappers had chosen their ground well, a city of millions, where anonymity was easier than invisibility. From this point forward, the inquiry would move along the narrow line between communication and deception, and its unlikely bridge would be an aging schoolteacher named John F. Condon. Condon was 63, retired from decades of teaching Latin and history. He lived quietly on East 233rd Street, a short walk from Woodlawn Cemetery. His reputation in the community was that of an eccentric patriot, well-read, outspoken, and drawn to moral causes. When he read of the Lindbergh tragedy, he felt compelled to act. On March 8, he published a letter in the Bronx Home News, offering to serve as intermediary and to contribute $1,000 of his own to the ransom. The gesture was impulsive, but within 2 days a reply arrived at his door, a small envelope bearing the kidnapper's emblem. Its appearance transformed Condon from spectator to participant in the most public crime of the era. The letter accepted him as go-between. It instructed that all further communication be carried through newspaper columns, and that he use the codename Jafsie, drawn from the sound of his initials. For investigators, desperate to re-establish contact, this was a breakthrough. Colonel Lindbergh authorized Condon's involvement, and Colonel Schwarzkopf arranged discreet supervision. From that moment, every movement of the retired teacher was logged by detectives who followed him through the crowded streets of the Bronx. Condon's home became a new node in the case. The letters arrived by ordinary post, written in the same paper and ink as those received at Hopewell. Each was photographed, numbered, and forwarded to Trenton and Washington. Analysts confirmed that the writer was identical to the author of the first 13 ransom notes. The consistency of pressure and formation ruled out forgery. The same mind, and the same hand, guided both. What investigators could not yet determine was location. The postmarks indicated the Bronx and Upper Manhattan, suggesting that the author operated within a few miles of Condon himself. On the evening of March 12th, after receiving instructions from the latest note, Condon followed a series of directions that led him to Woodlawn Cemetery. He was not alone. Plainclothes officers shadowed him from a distance. Near the western edge of the grounds, in the flicker of distant streetlights, a man appeared. The meeting lasted minutes. No one else heard what was said, but Condon later recounted every motion. The man's cautious stance, his hands held close, his accent, his reluctance to be seen. The stranger referred to himself as John, and insisted that payment must be made soon. In return for proof of identity, he promised to send a personal item belonging to the child. Then he disappeared among the tombstones, leaving Condon with instructions to wait. 4 days later, a small package arrived at Condon's address. Inside was a child's sleeping suit, identical to the one the Lindberghs described. It was accompanied by the 7th ransom note, reaffirming that the boy was alive and demanding the agreed sum. The suit was carried immediately to Hopewell, where Anne Lindbergh identified it beyond doubt. The discovery gave the case a fleeting sense of hope. For the first time since the night of the abduction, there was tangible evidence that the kidnappers possessed what they claimed. Yet it also deepened the trap. Payment now seemed inevitable. Over the next 10 days, Condon's correspondence became the heartbeat of the investigation. Each new note tightened the schedule and adjusted conditions for delivery. The kidnappers insisted on unmarked bills and minimal police presence. They warned that any deception would end the child's life. The instructions were precise, the tone commanding. Investigators prepared the ransom under the supervision of the Treasury Department. $50,000 in small denominations, most in gold certificates, their serial numbers meticulously recorded before being sealed in packets. The Bureau distributed lists of those numbers to banks across the country, a network of silent sentinels waiting for the money's inevitable reappearance. As negotiations advanced, the media frenzy intensified. Reporters learned of Condon's involvement and swarmed the Bronx. His modest house became a daily spectacle, crowds gathering on the sidewalk as he left for meetings. Police struggled to maintain secrecy. Each headline printed in the morning paper risked exposure of strategy by evening. The kidnappers responded with irritation in their letters, criticizing the publicity and threatening to withdraw. Condon pleaded for patience through his coded newspaper messages, using phrases pre-arranged in earlier correspondence. The strange conversation between criminal and civilian continued in full view of a nation that understood none of its code. By the final week of March, preparations for the ransom delivery were complete. Condon received explicit instructions, naming April 2 as the exchange date and identifying a new meeting point near a greenhouse at 32225 East Tremont Avenue. Detectives rehearsed the operation. Condon would go alone, carrying the money in a wooden box, while state troopers and bureau agents shadowed him at distance. The plan depended on silence and patience, two commodities scarce in a case that had consumed the public mind. The night arrived cold and damp. Condon left his house shortly after 8. The box concealed beneath his coat. Surveillance teams followed from several blocks away. When he reached the appointed place, a taxicab driver approached with a message. Another ransom note handed to him by an unknown man. It directed Condon to walk 100 feet to a vacant lot. Beneath a stone he found yet another note, the 12th in the sequence, ordering him deeper into the park. There, waiting in the shadows, was the same figure he had seen before. The two men spoke briefly. Condon handed over the box containing the ransom. In return he received the 13th note, which promised that the child could be found on a boat named Nellie near Martha's Vineyard. Then the stranger vanished once more into the darkness. Within hours, searches began along the Massachusetts coast. Patrol boats and aircraft swept the waters around the island, but no vessel by that name existed. The deception became clear. The kidnappers had obtained the money and provided nothing in return. Condon's last contact was over. The trail, meticulously built through weeks of correspondence, had ended in emptiness. For investigators, the aftermath was chaos. Public outrage reached its peak. Newspapers accused police of incompetence and federal agents of paralysis. The state police defended their methods, insisting that every decision had been made under duress. Yet behind the recriminations, a new phase of the investigation began. With the ransom paid, the primary objective shifted from recovery of the child to identification of those who had profited. The gold certificates, now dispersed into circulation, became the case's silent witnesses. The Bureau established a formal tracking system, unlike anything attempted before. Every branch office received copies of the serial numbers, and banks nationwide were instructed to forward reports of any matching currency. Agents visited clearinghouses, department stores, and even gasoline stations, distributing pamphlets and key cards, summarizing the ranges of numbers to watch for. The process was painstaking, but it laid the foundation for what would become the modern currency tracking protocol. Meanwhile, forensic examination of the physical evidence continued. The latter, still stored under guard in Trenton, was subjected to detailed analysis by woodworking experts. Measurements of the rungs and rails revealed irregularities that hinted at repurposed lumber. Investigators suspected that sections had once formed part of interior construction, perhaps flooring. They photographed tool marks and nail holes, preserving them for comparison. Although the significance was not yet clear, these details would later prove decisive. Back in the Bronx, Condon resumed his ordinary routine, though his life would never again be private. Detectives remained stationed near his home, monitoring correspondence in case the kidnappers renewed contact. Weeks passed without a single word. The silence confirmed the worst fears. By mid-April, hopes of recovering the child alive had faded. On May 12, 1932, that hope ended completely. A truck driver's assistant named William Allen discovered a small body half buried in a wooded area near Mount Rose, 4.5 miles southeast of the Lindbergh estate. The location was remote but within sight of the highway. The skull had been fractured. Decomposition indicated death within hours of abduction. Identification was immediate. The remnants of the sleeping garment matched the piece returned weeks earlier. The body of Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was cremated the following day in Trenton. The discovery transformed the case from extortion to murder. For the Bureau and the state police, it redefined every priority. The ransom trail, once a method of negotiation, became evidence of homicide. Attention returned to the notes, the handwriting, and the latter. Analysts compared samples against criminal records, searching for parallels in penmanship or phrasing. None matched. The perpetrator remained a phantom. Public mourning was immediate and immense. Flags across the nation were lowered. Editorials demanded new laws to bring kidnappers under federal jurisdiction. Within months, Congress would pass the Federal Kidnapping Act, soon known as the Lindbergh Law, granting the Bureau authority in future interstate abductions. The change was direct consequence of the failure now unfolding before the country. Yet even as grief dominated headlines, the investigation persisted quietly. Agents revisited every letter, tracing envelopes to specific post offices, narrowing the zone of origin to a few square miles in the Bronx. Surveillance of currency circulation intensified. The Bureau advised all banks to treat gold certificates with suspicion. Though paper currency remained common, gold notes were being withdrawn under new Treasury policy, making their use more conspicuous. In this narrowing field of attention lay the eventual path to the killer. For the moment, however, spring 1932 closed in silence. The ransom was gone, the child dead, and the letters exhausted. The Lindbergh family withdrew from public life. Condon, once hailed as intermediary, faced criticism for his role, yet remained convinced he had acted in good faith. Colonel Schwarzkopf reorganized his command, assigning new detectives to the currency tracking division. Director Hoover compiled the Bureau's first comprehensive summary of the case, a document that would later serve as blueprint for national investigative coordination. The months ahead would bring stagnation, then revelation. Somewhere in New York, among the countless hands that passed change across counters and gas pumps, the gold certificates would begin to surface again, one by one, leading back to a single carpenter's house on East 222nd Street. But in the spring of 1932, that connection was still buried beneath time and circumstance. The investigation stood suspended between despair and determination, awaiting the small accidents that would finally expose the man who called himself John. In the first days of April 1932, investigators across New Jersey and New York began to measure the aftermath of the ransom delivery. The money had disappeared into a city of 8 million people. The promised boat, the Nellie, did not exist. For several days, search vessels scanned the waters around Martha's Vineyard and Cape Cod, reporting nothing. Each negative finding tightened the sense that the transaction had been built on deceit from the beginning. The kidnappers had obtained what they wanted and dissolved into the crowd. At Hopewell, the command post persisted in motion despite exhaustion. The telephone lines that had once connected ransom negotiators now carried messages about lumber samples, handwriting exemplars, and bank reports. Every fragment of evidence was re-examined for significance that might have been missed in the urgency of negotiation. The latter became the physical anchor of the case, the single object left by the intruder that could be studied, measured, and preserved. Technicians photographed its joints and rungs, noting that one rail was slightly shorter than the other, and that certain tool marks ran diagonally, as if cut by a hand plane, rather than a machine. Its maker had known how to shape wood, but not how to perfect it. The ransom money, now beyond reach, remained the investigation's silent extension. Lists of serial numbers had been mailed to thousands of banks, each instructed to compare daily deposits against the Bureau's pamphlet. The process would take months, perhaps years, but it was the only line of pursuit that did not depend on luck. The FBI's New York office coordinated the effort, maintaining card files that recorded every reported bill, every bank that might have handled one, and every teller trained to recognize the sequence. It was an exercise in patience, rather than progress. Meanwhile, the household that had once been a home became a laboratory. Officers moved through rooms where personal life had ended. The nursery remained sealed, the crib untouched. Fingerprint powder still marked the window frame, a ghostly residue of the night when the search began. Outside, spring arrived across the fields of New Jersey, but within the stone walls of the estate, time seemed frozen. Lindbergh continued to coordinate personally with Schwarzkopf, reviewing reports each evening, driving long hours between Hopewell and Trenton. His public composure concealed a relentless private urgency. The belief that the kidnappers could still be found was the only force preventing collapse. In New York, Dr. Condon lived under constant observation. Detectives shadowed him through the streets, noting his mail, his visitors, and the occasional stranger who paused too long near his gate. None of the kidnappers' letters had arrived since early April. Their silence was as deliberate as their communication had once been. Investigators debated whether the criminals had fled the country or were lying low, content to spend the ransom gradually. The pattern of earlier postmarks suggested that at least one participant lived within a narrow radius of the Bronx and northern Manhattan. Patrolmen were instructed to record all suspicious transactions made with gold certificates in that area. During these weeks, the investigation began to evolve from reaction to structure. The Bureau's laboratory in Washington expanded its examination of the ransom notes, developing a formal comparative chart of letter formations. Every loop, angle, and pressure point was documented. Experts concluded that the writer exhibited controlled tremor, a sign of deliberate disguise rather than nervousness. It was the hand of someone forcing an accent onto paper. The laboratory's reports, transmitted to New Jersey by teletype, gave the first scientific vocabulary to what detectives had long described only by intuition. In this way, the Lindbergh case accelerated the professionalization of forensic handwriting analysis. Yet the public measured progress differently. Newspapers demanded resolution. Reporters camped outside Condon's house, outside the Trenton headquarters, outside the Lindbergh gates. Every rumor became headline material. Every denial became further evidence of incompetence. Under this pressure, the investigation turned inward, emphasizing documentation over speculation. Agents filled daily logs with procedural detail, routes driven, interviews conducted, reports filed. Hoover insisted that precision itself was a form of control, a bureaucracy of order in a landscape of chaos. False hope returned on April 6, when a letter postmarked from the Bronx reached the Bronx Home News Office. It repeated phrases familiar from earlier correspondence and included the kidnapper's symbol. The author claimed that the child was alive but ill, that further instructions would follow. Investigators traced the paper to a stationery shop on White Plains Road, but found nothing else linking the purchase to a suspect. Handwriting analysis confirmed the same origin as before. The letter was authentic, but it led nowhere. It existed only to prolong belief. 2 weeks later, a motorist reported seeing a small boat named Nellie near Long Island Sound. Patrols searched the shoreline. Nothing was found. Each new clue repeated the pattern of the previous ones. Plausible on its surface, hollow underneath. Detectives began to regard the Ransom correspondence as psychological warfare. The kidnappers had not only stolen a child, they had orchestrated a campaign of control that extended beyond the crime itself. Every response by law enforcement fulfilled their design, forcing reaction instead of initiative. As April drew to a close, nature intervened. Warm rain softened the soil around the estate, exposing fragments of debris previously hidden by winter frost. On May 12, 1932, a truck driver's assistant named William Allen noticed something pale protruding from a patch of ground near the highway south of Mount Rose. When he brushed aside the leaves, he saw bone. Police arrived within minutes, sealing the area. The body of a child, partly buried and decomposed, lay 45 feet from the road. Examination revealed a fractured skull and missing limbs. The clothing matched that of Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. The autopsy concluded that death had occurred roughly 10 weeks earlier, within hours of the abduction. The blow to the head was fatal. The rest had been concealment. The discovery ended one phase of the investigation and began another. The possibility of negotiation was gone. What remained was retribution. The funeral and cremation in Trenton the following day closed the personal chapter of the case. From then onward, it belonged to the state. Colonel Schwarzkopf reclassified the inquiry as homicide. Every piece of evidence gathered since March 1 was now measured against the standard of murder. Condon's correspondence, once considered negotiation, became potential proof of complicity. The Bureau re-examined every note, every envelope, every word. Across the country, the news struck with the weight of a national calamity. Churches held memorial services. Radio networks broadcast minutes of silence. Congressmen cited the case during debate on crime legislation. The argument that kidnapping should fall under federal jurisdiction had become undeniable. Within 2 months, the Federal Kidnapping Act would pass both houses, empowering the Bureau to pursue abductors who crossed state lines. The new law, quickly called the Lindbergh Law, was less a tribute than a memorial carved into statute. For investigators still in the field, the revelation of death's simplified motive. The abduction had never been about bargaining. It had been about profit. The ransom demand was camouflage for a killing that had occurred the night of the crime. With this conclusion, the center of gravity returned once more to the Bronx. The pattern of postmarks, the use of local vocabulary in the letters, and the origin of the stationery all pointed there. Detectives began methodically, interviewing every carpenter, roofer, and mechanic in the northern boroughs who fit the general description supplied by Condon. A man of medium height, broad shoulders, foreign accent, perhaps Scandinavian or German. The net was wide, and for now it caught only confusion. Meanwhile, new forms of forensic cooperation took shape. The Bureau created a centralized index, an early precursor of its later crime lab reference files, where every sample of handwriting, wood grain, and currency number was cross-cataloged. Analysts correlated the latter's dimensions with lumber sold in Bronx and Westchester County hardware stores. Each piece of white pine and Douglas fir was traced through invoices and distributors. These inquiries produced a mass of data, but no decisive match. What they built instead was a foundation of method that would outlive the case itself. Through late May, attention turned once more to the ransom money. Reports trickled in from banks and merchants, claiming to have handled gold certificates, but none bore the recorded serial numbers. Agents began to visit larger institutions personally, checking records and interviewing tellers. Every discovery proved false, yet each false lead reinforced the value of persistence. The Bureau circulated an internal directive: continue observation indefinitely. It would be 2 years before those efforts yielded the breakthrough they sought. In Hopewell, the Lindbergh estate gradually emptied. The command post closed, leaving only guards. Evidence was transferred to Trenton for storage. The latter, cleaned and relabeled, was mounted on brackets in the state police headquarters as reference for study. Its weathered rungs told the story of the night more clearly than any witness ever could. An approach, a climb, a fall, an escape. Forensic photographs of the wood revealed diagonal scars where plain blades had passed over soft grain, tiny mechanical signatures waiting to be matched to their maker. By early June, investigators had exhausted the immediate field of evidence. The case entered a period of quiet accumulation. Condon, though publicly vilified for his involvement, continued to cooperate, providing detailed written accounts of every meeting and conversation. His recollections formed the narrative spine of the official record, later tested against physical proof. He described the kidnapper's voice, his movements, the weight of the box containing the ransom. These details, once seen as mere color, would later align perfectly with the characteristics of a single suspect. Throughout the summer of 1932, the case remained unsolved, but never inactive. Agents revisited known criminals with histories of extortion, especially those of German origin. None fit completely. The suspect they sought seemed to exist in fragments. A skilled carpenter, a foreigner, a man with knowledge of both the Lindbergh home and police procedure. Somewhere those traits coexisted in one person, but no record revealed him. By autumn, the Lindbergh investigation had become an institution unto itself, sustained by the inertia of responsibility. It was too large to abandon and too empty to conclude. What the public saw as failure, law enforcement viewed as preparation. Every day added another layer of documentation that would later make identification indisputable. And beneath that documentation lay the physical evidence that would one day speak for itself. The latter, the handwriting, and the money that had not yet surfaced. As 1932 drew to its end, the great machine of inquiry settled into patient watchfulness. The FBI refined its lists. The state police maintained its archives, and the world gradually turned its attention elsewhere. Yet the name Lindbergh still evoked unfinished business. The false hope that had once sustained the search had become endurance. The token of proof, the sleeping suit returned by the kidnappers, remained locked in an evidence room, a symbol of deception preserved for judgment. 2 years would pass before another envelope, another trace of gold, reignited the pursuit. When that moment arrived, the machinery built in these months of despair would be ready. The path from Hopewell's silent nursery would lead, finally and inexorably, to a carpenter's garage in the Bronx. 2 years would pass before that link was proven, but in the spring of 1932, the search had already reached its quiet nadir. The ransom was gone, the correspondence ended, and the trail of clues that once promised recovery had dissolved into silence. Hopewell had emptied of reporters and detectives, leaving behind only the routines of maintenance and the stillness of a family retreat that had ceased to function as a home. Yet even as the investigation cooled, the countryside around it kept its secrets poorly. Beneath the thawing soil lay the evidence of finality, waiting to be uncovered by accident rather than design. On the morning of May 12, 1932, a truck from a local brickyard rolled south along the old Mount Rose Road. Its driver, Orville Wilson, steered slowly over the uneven surface, while his assistant, William Allen, scanned the roadside for debris that might puncture the tires. The season had turned wet. Pools of rainwater filled the ditches, and saplings grew thick along the embankment. Near a small clearing, roughly 4 miles southeast of the Lindbergh estate, Allen noticed something pale among the leaves. What looked at first like a piece of fabric, tangled in weeds. When he stepped closer, he realized it was bone. The police were called within minutes. State troopers arrived from Princeton, cordoning off the area before word could spread. They found the body of a small child, partially buried, the remains scattered by weather and animals. Clothing fragments and a single shoe lay nearby. The skull showed a fracture on the right side, and decomposition suggested the child had been dead for several weeks. The location, 45 feet from the roadway, screened by brush, placed it within a short distance of the main route leading away from Hopewell. Whoever had left the body there had done so quickly, perhaps during the same night as the abduction. Identification followed with grim efficiency. Nurse Betty Gow recognized the remnants of the child's sleeping garment. Anne Lindbergh confirmed small personal details that left no doubt. The coroner's report fixed the time of death at approximately 2 months earlier, consistent with the night of March 1. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skull. There were no signs of restraint or struggle. The simplest and most terrible explanation remained. The child had been killed almost immediately after being taken from his crib. News of the discovery reached Trenton by telegraph that afternoon. Colonel H. Norman Schwarzkopf ordered the site secured and all objects photographed before removal. Soil samples, bits of cloth, and nearby footprints were collected, though most were too degraded to analyze. The remains were transported under guard to the morgue in Trenton, where the autopsy confirmed the field diagnosis. The body was cremated the following day after authorization from the family. Within 24 hours, the most hopeful chapter of the investigation had closed forever. Public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The announcement of the child's death appeared in evening editions across the country. For weeks, Americans had followed the story with a kind of suspended belief. Now disbelief gave way to collective mourning and fury. Editorials demanded punishment before evidence, and the investigation's missteps were replayed in painful detail. How could negotiations have continued for weeks when the victim was already dead? How had the kidnappers stayed ahead of the police so completely? Questions that could not be answered became accusations, and every official connected to the case faced scrutiny. At Hopewell, the discovery produced a transformation. The estate was no longer treated as a potential recovery site, but as the scene of murder. Troopers re-examined every inch of ground between the house and the highway. Fresh maps were drawn, showing the line from the nursery window to the point where the ladder had been found, and onward through the woods toward the road. The route aligned almost perfectly with the position of the shallow grave. The conclusion was unavoidable. The killer had carried the child down the ladder, crossed the yard, reached the road, and disposed of the body within minutes. There had been no transport by car, no waiting accomplice, no elaborate getaway, only a swift act followed by concealment. This realization redefined the crime. What had been imagined as a ransom operation, orchestrated by a gang, now appeared to be the work of a single individual, someone confident enough to act alone and skilled enough to vanish afterward. The complexity of the ransom correspondence, the coded notes, the measured language, the prolonged negotiations, had disguised a simple reality. The communication served only to delay discovery and guarantee escape. The purpose of every letter was to buy time. Colonel Schwarzkopf reorganized the command structure to reflect the shift from recovery to homicide. The new objective was identification and conviction. The Bureau of Investigation assumed greater responsibility, establishing a full coordination office in New York, under Agent Leon Theroux. Hoover's analysts compiled a chronology from the abduction to the discovery of the body, cross-referencing the dates of each ransom note and postmark. Patterns began to emerge. All but one of the letters had originated from within the city's postal district north of 200th Street. The likely mailing area encompassed a few square miles in the Bronx. Investigators returned to Dr. Condon, the last person to have seen the mysterious John. His recollections took on new weight. He described the man's height, accent, and the cautious, almost formal way he handled the ransom box. Sketch artists produced renderings that circulated among precincts and immigration offices. The composite depicted a stocky, middle-aged man with sharp features and thinning hair, generic enough to match hundreds of residents, but precise enough that when the real face finally appeared, recognition would be instant. While the search for the living suspect intensified, forensic specialists continued to study the dead evidence. The latter underwent further examination by Arthur Kohler of the U.S. Forest Service, already recognized as one of the country's foremost wood identification experts. Kohler dismantled the structure, noting species, grain, and tool marks. He concluded that its builder possessed professional carpentry skills and had access to both pine and fir boards common to the northeastern lumber market. Certain rails bore nail hole patterns, suggesting they had once been part of indoor flooring. Kohler traced specific milling marks to a lumber yard in the Bronx that supplied builders within a 10-mile radius. The latter, long regarded as incidental, was becoming a map in wood. In Washington, handwriting analysts at the Bureau's laboratory consolidated their findings. After months of microscopic study, they confirmed that all 14 ransom notes had been written by the same person. The slant of each letter, the formation of double O's, and the spacing between words were identical. Analysts also noted linguistic traces, a mixture of German syntax and colloquial American spelling, that narrowed nationality. The writer was almost certainly a German immigrant who had lived in the United States for several years. Combined with Kohler's findings, the portrait sharpened, a skilled German carpenter residing in or near the Bronx. Despite this convergence, progress remained slow. Through June and July, detectives conducted background checks on every German tradesman with a criminal record or tax delinquency in New York. The effort produced nothing but paper. The suspect had no history that fit the pattern. The investigation's vast scale became its burden. Files stacked by the hundreds in Trenton and Washington, each repeating what was already known and omitting what mattered most: a name. The Lindbergh family withdrew entirely from public life. The estate, once crowded with investigators, emptied by summer. Colonel Lindbergh relocated to the Morrow residence in Englewood, leaving the Hopewell property under guard but unused. The site where the body had been found was fenced off, a temporary monument to futility. For months it remained untouched, except for the occasional visit by reporters photographing the clearing. To the public, the case had entered dormancy. To those inside it, the silence was deceptive. Beneath the surface, files were being organized, methods refined, and patience institutionalized. The Lindbergh Law passed Congress in June 1932, signed by President Hoover. It made interstate kidnapping a federal crime and granted the Bureau full jurisdiction in future cases. The law arrived too late to alter this investigation, but transformed everyone that followed. Within the Bureau, Hoover regarded it as both a victory and a responsibility, the symbolic reclaiming of national authority over chaos. Training manuals were rewritten, procedures codified. Out of the Lindbergh tragedy emerged the blueprint of the modern FBI. By late summer, the investigation's focus had narrowed to two tangible trails: the ladder and the ransom money. The first could identify the maker. The second could expose the user. Neither moved quickly. Kohler continued his tracing of lumber suppliers, sending reports that linked the wood to mills in South Carolina and Canada, before being distributed through Bronx yards. The Bureau's agents visited each outlet, checking invoices and delivery records. It was work of granular patience, building a chain of custody backward from artifact to origin. Meanwhile, The currency network functioned quietly but relentlessly. Each month, banks submitted forms listing any gold certificates received. Agents compared numbers, filed negatives, and waited. Occasionally a report seemed promising, a bill matching one of the ranges, but further inspection always disproved it. The economy itself was shifting. The federal recall of gold notes meant fewer in circulation. That scarcity, though frustrating now, would eventually turn to advantage. When the ransom bills reappeared, they would stand out. Through the remainder of 1932, and into the following year, the Lindbergh investigation remained officially open but publicly dormant. Newspapers moved on to other crises, bank failures, elections, new scandals. Only brief reminders appeared on anniversaries. Yet within the Bureau's files, the case continued to evolve. Its materials preserved with obsessive care. Each letter, photograph, and report was indexed, forming a silent architecture of evidence that would one day allow reconstruction in court with near mathematical precision. The discovery of the body had given the crime a beginning and an end. What it lacked was the bridge between them, the human connection capable of turning mystery into narrative. Somewhere within the Bronx lived the man who had written the notes, built the ladder, and spent the money. He had moved through the investigation like a shadow, shaping its every turn while remaining unseen. The officers who studied his work believed time itself would betray him. When he spent another ransom bill, when he cut another piece of wood, when he made one careless choice, the trail would reopen. Until then, the case endured in silence, suspended between tragedy and anticipation. The fields around Hopewell returned to grass. The newspapers yellowed in archives, and the memory of the small grave near Mount Rose faded from headlines. But the evidence remained, locked in cabinets labeled with the year and the word Lindbergh. Every generation of investigators who touched those files would note the same progression, from chaos to order, from despair to method. The discovery of the body had ended the search for the living child, but it had also marked the birth of modern forensic pursuit. What had begun with a broken ladder and a folded note now waited in the patient hands of science, for the moment when the murderer would surface, unaware that every step he took had already been mapped. When the body was found and buried, the case might have faded into history, yet the investigation did not die with its victim. It simply entered a slower orbit. From the spring of 1932 until the late summer of 1934, the Lindbergh file remained open across 3 command centers: Trenton, the New York field office, and Washington, sustained by the belief that the evidence itself would one day summon its maker. The world around the case changed. The Depression deepened. Banks collapsed. Roosevelt replaced Hoover in the White House. But inside the Bureau, the discipline imposed by the kidnapping endured like ritual. Each week clerks compared new bank statements with the master list of ransom numbers. Each month, Arthur Kohler in Wisconsin sent updates from his lumber tracings. And every few weeks, Colonel Schwarzkopf filed summaries, reminding everyone that the murderer had not yet been found. The work no longer resembled pursuit. It was endurance. Through 1933, the investigation lived in paperwork. Agents checked ship manifests for anyone leaving the East Coast under German names. Immigration files, draft cards, and carpentry union rolls were combed for foreign tradesmen with sudden prosperity. None matched. The real suspect, Bruno Richard Hauptmann, worked quietly in his Bronx garage, earning small wages and spending carefully. He blended into the same working-class anonymity that had hidden him from the first day. The latter analysis advanced further than any other lead. Kohler dismantled each section, tracing the grain of its boards back through the lumber supply chain. He determined that one rail bore identical milling marks to pine shipped from the McCormick Mill in South Carolina to the National Lumber and Mill Company in the Bronx. From there, the wood had been sold in late 1931 to a handful of customers within a 10-mile radius. Kohler's report, dense, methodical, narrowed the list, but did not name a buyer. The clue waited like a seed, inert but alive. Inside the Bureau, Director Hoover saw in this stagnation a chance to test his new system of centralized intelligence. The Lindbergh investigation became a proving ground. Every memo, photograph, and sample was indexed by number and cross-referenced by subject. The resulting archive, stored in gray file drawers, represented the Bureau's first national case file, evidence not only of a crime, but of institutional transformation. The meticulous order that later defined Hoover's FBI had its origin in this long watch. Public interest, though quieter, never disappeared. On anniversaries, the newspapers republished photographs of the child, the ladder, and the ransom note. Editorials alternated between outrage and resignation. For the Lindbergh family, each article reopened wounds. For investigators, it maintained pressure. No one could close the case while the public still expected justice. In May 1933, a small spark appeared. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York reported the discovery of nearly $310 gold certificates, bearing serial numbers from the ransom list. They had arrived in a single deposit, labeled J.J. Faulkner, 537, West 149th Street. Agents traced the address to a tenement building. No such person existed. Residents remembered no Faulkner. The deposit had been made through a local bank messenger, who could not describe the depositor clearly. After weeks of inquiry, The trail went cold. Still, the find confirmed what everyone suspected. The ransom bills were circulating again, quietly, inside New York. The Bureau intensified its currency tracking program. Pamphlets of serial numbers were distributed to banks, department stores, gasoline chains, and post offices. Thousands of clerks memorized the distinctive ranges. A simple routine took shape. When any gold certificate appeared, the teller compared its number against the printed sheet, then phoned the nearest FBI contact. Most calls yielded nothing, but the system trained a city to look. At the same time, the Roosevelt administration's Gold Recall Order of 1933 changed the landscape. Citizens were required to surrender gold coins and certificates to the Treasury in exchange for paper currency. The Bureau realized that this order would flush out anyone still holding ransom notes. Gold certificates became conspicuous. Each transaction involving them risked notice. Hoover's agents quietly welcomed the law as an investigative gift. Meanwhile, rumors and imposters multiplied. Con men posed as intermediaries, promising new evidence. Psychics mailed visions of buried treasure. One notorious fraudster, Gaston Means, convinced Washington socialite Evelyn Walsh McLean to give him $100,000, claiming he could recover the Lindbergh child. Means pocketed the money and disappeared, until agents arrested him for embezzlement. The spectacle reinforced Hoover's insistence on method over drama. Throughout 1933, field reports followed, the same rhythm: interviews, dead ends, waiting. Kohler continued his correspondence with the Bureau, refining his wood-matching charts. He noted that one ladder rail had been sawed by a blade with an uneven set of teeth, distinctive enough to identify if the tool were found. His files, meticulous and quiet, became the forensic conscience of the case. By autumn, national attention had turned elsewhere. Prohibition ended. The new president's New Deal dominated headlines. Only the agents assigned to the Lindbergh file kept vigil. In their offices, the ransom note handwriting samples hung pinned beside enlarged photographs of the latter. They studied them not for inspiration, but for familiarity, until the patterns imprinted themselves like faces. Then, in August 1934, the waiting broke. A $10 gold certificate surfaced at a Corn Exchange Bank branch on 125th Street and Park Avenue. A teller recognized its serial number from the Bureau's pamphlet and alerted his manager, who telephoned the New York office. The deposit slip traced the bill to a filling station at 127th Street and Lexington Avenue. The attendant remembered the customer, a stocky, middle-aged man driving a dark Dodge sedan. Suspicious of the outdated currency, the attendant had written the car's license number on the note itself before handing over the change. That small act of caution, invisible to everyone else, broke the silence of 2 years. The license was registered to Bruno Richard Hauptmann, carpenter, 1279 East 222nd Street, Bronx. Agents began surveillance immediately. For 24 hours they watched his brick duplex, noting his habits: the morning walks to the garage, the modest meals with his wife Anna, the routine of a man with nothing to hide. Yet every record they checked confirmed the opposite. Hauptmann had entered the country illegally, a decade earlier, after prison time in Germany. He owned no business yet traded stocks through a Manhattan broker, living on savings that seemed too deep for a carpenter's wage. The pattern fit the invisible profile that investigators had built from fragments. On the morning of September 19, 1934, as Hauptmann stepped from his house toward his car, detectives from the New York Police Department and agents from the Bureau closed in. He was arrested without resistance. In his wallet they found a $20 gold certificate from the ransom list. Within hours, a search of his garage uncovered a wooden gasoline can with the false bottom of its lid, concealing $13,000 in ransom bills. The long watch had ended. That night, handwriting experts compared samples from Hauptmann's papers with the ransom notes preserved in the Bureau's archive. The match was immediate. Every peculiarity, the long loops, the misshapen O's, the European spelling, aligned. Kohler, notified by telegram, requested a section of the suspect's attic flooring for examination. Days later, he confirmed that one plank had been cut away and that the remaining joists bore the same pattern of nail holes as the ladder rail he had studied 2 years earlier. The piece missing from the attic fit the ladder exactly. The chain of evidence, dormant for years, now closed in a single circle. When the news broke, the country exhaled a collective breath that had been held since 1932. Headlines declared the capture of the Lindbergh kidnapper. Crowds gathered outside police headquarters. For the Bureau and for Hoover personally, the arrest validated every hour of patient cataloging. For the public, it offered the illusion of closure. In truth, the story was only halfway told. Hauptmann's guilt would have to be proven in court. His motives, reconstructed. His denial, recorded. But the investigation that had begun with a missing child and a broken ladder had reached its inevitable target through the slow mechanics of record-keeping, vigilance, and chance. The long watch was over, and the machinery of justice, once static, now began to move with unstoppable force toward Flemington, New Jersey, where the world would soon watch its verdict. The announcement of Bruno Richard Hauptmann's arrest spread through New York before noon, moving from precinct whispers to radio bulletins in less than an hour. By evening, the sidewalks around the Bronx station swelled with reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers pressing against police lines. For 2 years, the Lindbergh kidnapping had existed as rumor and paperwork. Now it had a face. The man who emerged from the station under guard looked nothing like the nation's imagined villain. No scarred gangster or shadowed mastermind, but a quiet craftsman in worn clothes, blinking against the camera flashes. Yet, in the evidence already collected from his home and garage, investigators believed they had found the bridge between tragedy and resolution. Within hours of the arrest, detectives cataloged the items seized from Hauptmann's property. The gas can containing $13,760 in gold certificates was the centerpiece. But there was more: tools, lumber scraps, nails, notebooks, and handwriting samples. Each object was photographed, labeled, and shipped under escort to Trenton for examination. The Bureau's laboratory received copies of the handwriting immediately. Analysts compared them to the ransom letters preserved since 1932. The resemblance was not superficial. It was structural. The same irregularities of spacing, the same misplaced double consonants, the same peculiar German-influenced phrasing. Gut for good, anything for anything. Under magnification, letter forms matched stroke for stroke. The laboratory's conclusion, issued within 24 hours, was unequivocal. The ransom notes and Hauptmann's writing had come from the same hand. Meanwhile, agents re-examined the carpentry evidence. Arthur Kohler received samples of wood removed from Hauptmann's attic. He measured grain width and growth rings, aligning them against the ladder rails cataloged 2 years earlier. The patterns interlocked perfectly. One section of pine from the attic floor was missing. The ladder's side rail filled that absence like a puzzle piece. To Kohler, this was no coincidence. The wood bore identical milling scars from a blade with a chipped tooth. The report he drafted that week would later stand among the most decisive forensic documents ever produced. At the 222nd Street house, investigators found further corroboration. Behind a closet door, written in pencil on the molding, were the words John Condon and his Bronx address, the very intermediary used during the ransom exchanges. No innocent reason could explain its presence. In the cellar, they discovered a piece of rough-cut pine, stained with the same varnish as the ladder rungs. The cumulative weight of these findings transformed suspicion into certainty. By the third day, New Jersey's governor authorized formal extradition. Public fascination reached fever pitch. Newspapers printed Hauptmann's photograph beside images of the Lindbergh child, the ladder, and the ransom notes. Editorials called it divine justice. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, shouting for execution. In the press, he was no longer a suspect, but the baby killer of the Bronx. The state police maintained constant vigilance to prevent lynching attempts. Inside his cell, Hauptmann refused to speak beyond short denials. He admitted possession of the money, but claimed it had been left to him by a deceased friend named Isidore Fish. The story changed little in retelling and convinced no one. Agents traced Fish's records. The man had indeed died in Germany, but no evidence connected him to ransom letters or payments. The Fish story, as newspapers dubbed it, became shorthand for evasion. As forensic reports accumulated, Hoover instructed his field offices to consolidate every fragment of the investigation since 1932. Agents cross-checked bank statements, verifying that each ransom bill found in Hauptmann's possession matched those recorded before the exchange. The serial sequences aligned with mathematical precision. In the language of the Bureau, probability gave way to proof. The combination of currency, handwriting, and wood analysis formed a triad of evidence rarely seen in criminal history. What had begun as tragedy was evolving into demonstration, a display of modern scientific policing, designed for public consumption as much as for justice. On September 24th, a grand jury convened in the Bronx to indict Hauptmann on charges of extortion. Crowds filled the courthouse square. Camera flashes lit the steps like gunfire. The indictment was only the first step. 2 weeks later, New Jersey prosecutors filed formal murder charges in Hunterdon County. Extradition hearings followed, contested by defense attorneys who argued that the evidence was circumstantial. But the political momentum was irreversible. On October 19, 1934, the suspect was transferred under heavy guard to the Flemington jail to await trial. The convoy's journey south became a moving spectacle. Every town it passed erupted in cheers or jeers. Farmers left their fields to watch. By the time it reached the county seat, dusk had fallen, and floodlights illuminated the courthouse square. Reporters from every major newspaper in the United States, and several from Europe, occupied rented rooms nearby. The small New Jersey town, accustomed to quiet commerce, transformed overnight into a global stage. In Trenton, Colonel Schwarzkopf supervised the cataloging of evidence for presentation. Each ransom bill was photographed front and back. Each ladder section was tagged, its joints reinforced to preserve integrity. The Bureau's handwriting charts were enlarged for courtroom display. The case file filled more than 40 volumes. No detail, however minor, escaped inclusion. The prosecution's approach was not only to prove guilt, but to demonstrate the triumph of order over anarchy, the capability of modern institutions to conquer the lawlessness that had defined the early Depression years. Yet beneath the confidence ran unease. Some investigators recognized that the circumstantial chain, while strong, still depended on inference. No witness had seen Hauptmann at Hopewell. No fingerprint linked him directly to the nursery. The power of the case lay in accumulation, not in singular revelation. For Hoover's Bureau, this was enough. Science and patience had spoken. But defense attorneys would later seize on those absences as gaps through which doubt might enter. As autumn deepened, Hauptmann's life before the crime came under examination. He had been born in Saxony, Germany. In 1899, apprenticed as a carpenter, and imprisoned for armed robbery before emigrating illegally to the United States in 1923. He married Anna Schofler, a New York waitress, and lived a modest existence until the spring of 1932, when he abruptly stopped working, yet continued trading on the stock market. Investigators calculated that his investments during that period corresponded closely with the distribution of the ransom money. The pattern was damning in its precision, withdrawal after withdrawal, matching the gradual spending of specific denominations. Meanwhile, the Bureau's scientific staff prepared for court with rehearsed demonstrations. Kohler's ladder would be presented like a surgical exhibit, the attic plank fitting into place before the jury. Handwriting experts practiced overlay projections showing the alignment between ransom notes and Hauptmann's documents. Even the gas can, with its false bottom concealing the money, was cleaned, tagged, and readied for display. Every object would speak. Through it all, Hauptmann remained composed. In custody, he followed routine, reading newspapers, eating little, writing letters to his wife asserting innocence. Observers noted his calmness, interpreting it alternately as stoicism or indifference. To the public, he had become emblem of the crime's enormity, absorbing the collective outrage of a nation that had mourned a child and waited 2 years for retribution. On October 10th, Governor Herbert Lehman of New York signed the final extradition order. At dawn the next day, escorted by state troopers, Hauptmann was driven to the New Jersey border and handed over to Colonel Schwarzkopf's men. Photographers captured every moment. The handcuffs, the transfer papers, the stoic profile of the prisoner against the police car window. Those images appeared on front pages worldwide, accompanied by captions proclaiming that the Lindbergh case was finally approaching justice. In Flemington jail, security was absolute. Guards rotated in 6-hour shifts. Reporters were barred from direct contact. The cell itself was bare. Iron bed, table, chair, and a single light that burned through the night. Outside, spectators gathered daily, hoping for a glimpse. The town's hotels filled with correspondents, and the county courthouse prepared for the unprecedented attention that would descend when proceedings began. The trial was scheduled for January 3, 1935. For investigators who had lived with the case since 1932, the capture closed one era and opened another. The long pursuit that had defined their professional lives was finished. What remained was performance, the careful translation of years of evidence into a narrative that a jury could absorb. The ladder, the handwriting, and the gold certificates had done their work. Now they would speak in a courtroom instead of a laboratory. Outside official circles, the public viewed Hauptmann's arrest as redemption. To a nation struggling through depression, the case symbolized the restoration of control, the belief that no matter how cruel or distant the crime, the institutions of law could still prevail. The press described it as science catching evil. For Hoover, it was vindication, proof that the FBI's discipline could outlast chaos itself. As winter approached, Flemington awaited its spectacle. Inside the courthouse, benches were rebuilt to hold crowds. Telephone lines were installed for national radio coverage. Witness lists stretched for pages. Detectives, handwriting experts, neighbors, bankers, and the retired schoolteacher, whose coded advertisements had once connected victim and criminal. All were summoned to speak. Outside, banners hung from buildings, reading justice for the Lindbergh baby. On the final night of 1934, under snow and floodlight, reporters walked the empty courthouse square. Through the frosted windows they could see the jury box waiting, the evidence tables draped in white cloth, the ladder propped against a wall like a relic. In its grain lay 2 years of labor, and in the man sleeping in the county jail lay the last unresolved question, whether guilt could ever balance the scale of loss. The next dawn would begin the trial that would decide not only Hauptmann's fate but the legacy of American justice itself. The first dawn of January 3, 1935, rose cold over Flemington, New Jersey. Floodlights glared against the courthouse facade, their beams cutting through fog that hung over the square. Before sunrise, hundreds of spectators already stood behind barricades, stamping their feet for warmth, waiting to glimpse the man accused of the century's most notorious crime. Inside, the Hunterdon County Courthouse had been transformed into a fortress. State troopers lined every corridor. Reporters filled the benches, their typewriters clattering even before proceedings began. At the center of the storm sat Bruno Richard Hauptmann, expressionless, neatly dressed, watching the preparations that would determine whether he lived or died. The case, formally titled State of New Jersey vs. Bruno Richard Hauptmann, opened under the glare of global attention. Judge Thomas Trenchard presided. Attorney General David Willents led the prosecution. Defense attorney Edward Riley, once celebrated, now past his prime, represented Hauptmann. The prosecution's objective was simple: to transform 2 years of evidence into one coherent chain, linking the defendant to the abduction, the ransom, and the death of Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. Every seat inside the small courtroom was occupied. Outside, loudspeakers carried summaries of testimony to the crowds. Radio networks delivered hourly bulletins, nationwide. For 5 weeks, the town of Flemington became the center of the modern world's appetite for justice. The first days were procedural, jury selection, motions, the reading of indictments, but tension was immediate. Prosecutors presented the case as the inevitable conclusion of scientific persistence. They introduced the ladder, the ransom notes, the gold certificates, and the handwriting charts, as if unveiling relics of faith. Each item had been handled by specialists and packaged for maximum clarity. When the ladder was carried into the courtroom, reporters noted the collective intake of breath from the spectators. The wooden structure, scarred and weathered, stood upright beside the witness box throughout the trial, a silent reminder of the crime's brutality. Wilens's opening statement traced the entire story from March 1st, 1932, to Hauptmann's arrest. His voice was calm, deliberate, and relentless. He promised to prove that the man before them had planned the kidnapping, built the ladder from wood in his own attic, written every ransom note, and murdered the child for profit. He acknowledged there were no eyewitnesses, but insisted that every nail, every board, and every dollar bill pointed to one man. The defense offered little in response beyond a general denial. Hauptmann sat impassive, occasionally whispering to Riley, but mostly staring forward, his hands folded. The prosecution's parade of witnesses began with handwriting experts from the Bureau and the Treasury Department. Enlarged photographs of the ransom notes were projected on screens for the jury. Each analyst explained the microscopic consistencies, the pressure of upward strokes, the peculiar formation of the letter T, the spacing after commas. Under questioning, they compared these details to samples of Hauptmann's grocery lists and financial notes. The similarities were undeniable, even to untrained eyes. Newspapers the next day printed side-by-side enlargements. Readers at breakfast could trace guilt across the page. Next came Arthur Kohler, summoned from the Forest Service laboratory, with his ladder sections carefully labeled. Calm and precise, he recounted his years of analysis, the identification of wood species, the tracing of lumber mills, and the discovery that one rail of the ladder matched the missing board from Hauptmann's attic. He placed the plank against the ladder in front of the jury. The fit was perfect, each nail hole aligned. Each grain of pine continued seamlessly from one piece to the next. Kohler's testimony carried the quiet authority of science unadorned by emotion. Reporters later wrote that his evidence spoke louder than any witness. Bank employees and tellers followed, recounting how ransom bills surfaced in ordinary transactions. The gas station attendant, who wrote down the license number, the clerk who spotted serial numbers, the agents who connected each discovery back to the defendant's possession. Charts displayed the sequential order of bills recovered from his garage. The cumulative impression was devastating. A 2-year trail of money converging on one address. When Dr. John Condon took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Age had bent him, but his memory remained sharp. He described the letters, the coded communications, and the night in Woodlawn Cemetery when he handed the ransom to the man who called himself John. Pointing to Hauptmann, he stated that this was the same man. His testimony was direct, unwavering. Riley's cross-examination tried to shake him, but Condon held firm. The jury watched the old man's trembling hand indicate the defendant, and many wrote notes at that moment. Colonel Charles Lindbergh himself appeared next. His presence transformed the trial from a legal proceeding into a national ritual. Dressed in military uniform, composed but pale, he recounted how he had listened from a nearby car during Condon's meeting at the cemetery and recognized the kidnapper's voice as the same accent he now heard from the witness chair during pre-trial hearings. He spoke briefly, leaving the courtroom under heavy guard as spectators wept and applauded. No testimony carried more emotional weight, even though it added little in hard evidence. The defense countered with a narrative of coincidence and persecution. Riley argued that the money had indeed been in Hauptmann's possession, but as inheritance from his late friend Fish. He claimed the attic board had been removed years earlier for repairs, not for crime. and that handwriting similarities were products of coincidence, amplified by bias. He emphasized the absence of fingerprints and the lack of direct witnesses at the scene of the kidnapping. The argument found occasional sympathy among observers, but little traction with the jury. Hauptmann's refusal to testify until late in the proceedings hurt his own case. When he finally did, his denial seemed rehearsed, his explanations improbable. Outside the courthouse, crowds swelled daily. Vendors sold hot drinks, postcards, and souvenir ladders. Newsreel cameras captured the frenzy for theaters across America. Radio commentators described the demeanor of witnesses, the color of the prosecutor's tie, the texture of the defendant's expression. Flemington's population of 3,000 hosted more than 10 times that number each week. For small-town residents, the world had arrived at their door, bringing with it the noise of civilization's demand for vengeance. Inside, order held. Judge Trenchard maintained rigid control, sustaining objections with clip precision. The evidence, though circumstantial, built layer upon layer, until the defense's protests seemed to dissolve under weight, rather than rebuttal. By late January, Wylance concluded with a summation that framed the case as moral restoration. A nation's conscience tested and reaffirmed through law. No man, he declared, can escape the consequences of his own design. The courtroom, packed beyond capacity, listened in near silence. The jury retired on the evening of February 13, 1935. Snow fell outside while reporters waited in the square, telephones ready to carry the verdict to every newsroom in America. After 11 hours of deliberation, at 10 minutes past 10 p.m., the jurors returned. The foreman stood, his voice steady. Guilty of murder in the first degree. The words echoed through the hall before the crowd erupted. Some cheered, others prayed. Hauptmann remained motionless, then glanced briefly toward the spectators, before being led away. The sentence, death by electrocution, was announced 2 days later. For the Bureau and for state authorities, the verdict was vindication. Hoover issued a statement praising cooperation between federal and state agencies. Newspapers hailed the outcome as proof that modern science had triumphed over criminal cunning. Flemington returned to uneasy calm, its brief transformation into a global capital of justice, ending as swiftly as it began. Yet doubts persisted among some observers. A handful of journalists and legal scholars questioned aspects of the evidence: the chain of custody for the money, the reliability of eyewitness identification, the fairness of the proceedings under such public pressure. These murmurs would grow louder in later decades. But in the winter of 1935, the nation wanted closure, not complexity. The image of Lindbergh saluting the court, the latter displayed like a trophy, and the condemned man's impassive face satisfied a collective hunger that had festered for 3 years. In the weeks following the verdict, appeals were filed automatically. Riley argued procedural error and insufficiency of evidence. The Supreme Court of New Jersey affirmed the conviction on October 9, 1935. A final petition to the United States Supreme Court was denied in December. Each legal door closed as predictably as it opened. On January 17, 1936, Hauptmann was scheduled for execution, but Governor Harold Hoffman granted a 30-day reprieve to review new claims of doubt. Investigators rechecked confessions from unrelated criminals, verified alibis, and interviewed witnesses whose memories had grown uncertain. None altered the outcome. On February 17th, the sentence was reaffirmed. In the final weeks of his life, Hauptmann continued to deny guilt. He wrote letters asserting innocence, refused offers to commute the sentence in exchange for confession, and met briefly with his wife and young son. Outside the prison, crowds gathered nightly, alternately chanting for mercy and vengeance. Reporters camped along the fence line, filing stories about the condemned man's meals, his posture, his silence. Every detail of his final days became part of the legend. At 8:47 p.m., April 3, 1936, in the Trenton State Prison, the switch was thrown. Witnesses reported a flash, a smell of ozone, and stillness. The execution lasted 2 minutes. The man whose name had filled headlines for 4 years was gone, leaving behind more paper than words, a record of investigation, testimony, and procedure, unmatched in American criminal history. The Lindbergh case closed officially that night, but its shadow remained. It had transformed law enforcement, birthed the federal kidnapping statute, and shaped the FBI's identity as the nation's scientific guardian. It had also left behind questions that would never entirely fade, questions about chance, evidence, and the line between justice and spectacle. For those who had lived the case, from the troopers at Hopewell to the agents in Washington, the sound of the cell door closing on Hauptmann marked both an ending and a warning. That truth in such crimes was never absolute, only assembled from fragments strong enough to convince a jury and a country that wanted to believe. When the current in the chair ceased, and the witnesses were let out, the long shadow of the Lindbergh case should have ended. Yet even as the smell of ozone faded from the execution chamber, doubts were already taking form. For 4 years the investigation had consumed the nation. Its conclusion, though decisive, could not silence what remained unsettled. Within days of Bruno Richard Hauptmann's death, letters flooded newspapers and government offices, questioning whether justice had been done, or merely declared. The story, once framed as tragedy redeemed by law, now began its second life, as controversy. The first wave of uncertainty came from within New Jersey itself. Governor Harold Hoffman, who had granted the final reprieve, publicly expressed discomfort with aspects of the prosecution. He ordered the state police to review the evidence and interview witnesses who had testified at Flemington. Hoffman's action was politically explosive. To the public, it appeared as a challenge to the sanctity of the verdict. To law enforcement, it felt like betrayal. Colonel Schwarzkopf defended his department's work, insisting that every test, every document, every photograph had been verified beyond doubt. The Bureau echoed that assurance from Washington, but Hoffman's quiet doubts refused to vanish. In private conversations, he admitted that something about the case felt too complete, as if tied together after the fact. Reporters seized upon these remarks, reigniting national attention. Magazine articles dissected the forensic evidence, pointing out that fingerprints had never been found on the latter or the ransom notes, that some witness identifications had changed over time, and that portions of the ransom money remained missing. The public, having once celebrated the system's precision, now began to suspect its haste. The same photographs of the ladder and the gas can that had symbolized triumph were reprinted under new headlines, asking whether certainty had been manufactured. In the months following the execution, new voices entered the debate. Journalists like Anthony Scaduto and Ludovic Kennedy, writing later, but drawing from this period's unrest, would reconstruct the investigation as a cautionary tale about circumstantial justice. In 1936, however, the loudest defender of Hauptmann's innocence was his widow, Anna Hauptmann. Alone in New York, she began a decades-long campaign to clear her husband's name. She gave interviews, petitioned governors, and collected affidavits from witnesses who recanted or softened earlier statements. To her, the man executed in Trenton was not the monster depicted in newspapers, but a victim of hysteria. Her persistence kept the controversy alive long after the country had turned to other matters. Within the Bureau, there was no such uncertainty. Hoover regarded the case as a benchmark of federal cooperation and forensic rigor. He ordered the original files preserved in full, a rare practice at the time, and cited the investigation in training lectures as the model of patient, evidence-driven pursuit. The Lindbergh file, as it became known internally, filled entire cabinets in Washington. Agents newly recruited in the late 1930s were required to study its chronology as part of their induction. It had become both trophy and textbook. For law enforcement nationwide, the impact was profound. The Federal Kidnapping Act, passed in 1932 and strengthened after the trial, had transformed the Bureau's authority. Now, whenever a kidnapping crossed state lines, federal jurisdiction was automatic. The phrase Lindbergh Law entered everyday vocabulary. By the end of the decade, kidnappings declined sharply. Criminals understood that flight across state borders no longer meant escape. The case that had begun with a child's crib had reshaped the structure of American policing. Meanwhile, the personal aftermath for those closest to it was quieter but equally permanent. Charles and Anne Lindbergh, unable to escape the constant scrutiny, withdrew from public life. The couple relocated first to Europe, seeking anonymity. Newspapers followed them across the Atlantic, publishing photographs of the aviator visiting German airfields, unaware that their presence in Europe would later provoke its own controversy. For the Lindberghs, the need for peace outweighed all perception. The tragedy had not only stolen their son, but consumed their country's curiosity. In New Jersey, Colonel Schwarzkopf retired soon after the trial, his career defined forever by the case. Arthur Kohler returned to the Forest Service, his latter analysis hailed as proof that material evidence could speak with human clarity. Dr. John Condon faded from view, his later years marked by eccentric public appearances and interviews where he repeated his story without variation, as though reliving it ensured its reality. He died convinced that justice had been served. Yet the files themselves continued to breathe. Scholars and journalists revisiting the case found contradictions. Some questioned whether all ransom notes were written by the same hand, or if accomplices had been involved. Others pointed to inconsistencies in the timeline, how the latter appeared to have been built by one man. Yet the movement of the ransom money suggested several. The missing portion of the ransom, nearly half the original amount, never surfaced. No explanation satisfied every question. By 1938, the Lindbergh investigation had shifted from event to artifact. The Bureau's laboratory displayed copies of the ransom notes and photographs of the latter as teaching tools. Public lectures on forensic science used the case to illustrate the power of microscopic analysis. The handwriting comparisons, the wood grain matches, the serial number tracking, all became foundational elements in criminal investigation textbooks. In the culture of law enforcement, the Lindbergh case was no longer a tragedy, but an origin story. Beyond the institutions, the public fascination endured in print and rumor. Books and serialized features dramatized the kidnapping as modern myth. The heroic aviator brought low by fate, the cunning immigrant criminal, the triumph of science, the moral restoration of order. Each retelling reflected the anxieties of its era: fear of crime, mistrust of outsiders, faith in technology. In this transformation, the real child, the real suffering, and even the real investigation began to dissolve into symbols. Through the late 1930s, the widow's appeals moved through the courts, each dismissed on procedural grounds. Anna Hauptmann's letters to governors and presidents grew increasingly personal, describing poverty, harassment, and loneliness. Yet her campaign attracted sympathizers among civil liberties groups, emerging during the New Deal years. To them, the case represented the dangers of mob justice and media influence. In that context, the debate over Hauptmann's guilt evolved into a broader discussion about due process in an age of mass communication. Meanwhile, within academic circles, criminologists dissected the case as the first to combine traditional detective work with laboratory science. Universities invited bureau representatives to lecture on the Lindbergh method. The emphasis was less on innocence or guilt than on the transformation of investigation into exact procedure. The case had taught the nation that evidence could be mechanized, that the pursuit of truth could follow the logic of experiment. It was both reassurance and illusion. By 1939, as Europe moved toward war, the Lindbergh story began to fade from headlines. The aviator himself became embroiled in controversy over his admiration for aspects of German aviation progress, further complicating the public's view of a man once considered untouchable. For Hoover and the Bureau, however, the case remained a cornerstone of legitimacy. When the FBI's new headquarters opened exhibits on its history, one display was devoted entirely to the Lindbergh kidnapping. The ladder, the notes, and a facsimile of the gold certificates. Visitors filed past in silence, confronting evidence transformed into monument. In private, some of those who had worked the case admitted unease that the story's ending felt too final. No accomplices had ever been charged, the remaining ransom money never found. Yet bureaucratic closure required finality. To reopen questions would be to reopen doubt about the very system the case had helped build. The investigation therefore ended, not by discovery, but by decision. By the close of the decade, America stood on the brink of new conflict, and the Lindbergh kidnapping receded into memory, a crime that had changed everything and explained nothing. In its wake, it left two legacies, one institutional, one emotional. The institutional legacy was the architecture of federal investigation, centralized records, forensic laboratories, and jurisdiction that reached from coast to coast. The emotional legacy was the lingering sense that justice, even when served, carried the price of uncertainty. In the quiet rooms of archives, where the original documents rested, the photographs of the ladder's grain and the careful handwriting charts still conveyed an aura of precision. But between those ordered lines lived the story of chaos, chance, and grief that no chart could capture. By 1940, the Lindbergh case had completed its transformation, from tragedy to legend, from investigation to doctrine, from crime to cautionary tale. The names of its participants scattered into history, but its shadow remained on every case file that bore the FBI's seal, a reminder that the pursuit of justice, once begun, never truly ends. The lights inside Trenton State Prison dimmed after the execution, but the case that had begun 4 years earlier refused to die with its prisoner. The Lindbergh kidnapping, once a single crime, had become a phenomenon that would shape the nation's justice system, its culture, and its conscience. From that night forward, every investigator, legislator, and journalist who touched the story would carry its imprint. The body was buried, the evidence archived, yet the questions it left behind remained alive. In the weeks following Hauptmann's death, the public clung to the sense that finality had been achieved. Newspapers framed the execution as the restoration of order, justice completed, science vindicated, the state triumphant. But beneath the headlines, quiet doubt began to circulate. In New Jersey, Governor Harold Hoffman reviewed the case again, uneasy with how swiftly the machinery of punishment had turned. He ordered transcripts re-examined and witnesses re-interviewed, hoping for confirmation that never came. No new evidence surfaced, but neither did certainty. The official record remained flawless, yet somehow incomplete. The Bureau closed its file, stamping it solved, and placed the documents in Washington's archives. Hoover regarded it as proof of his institution's ascendancy, the ultimate example of what coordinated, scientific policing could achieve. The investigation had been the crucible through which the modern FBI had been forged. Centralized records, laboratory precision, forensic discipline, the handwriting comparisons, the ladder wood analysis, the serial number tracing of the ransom bills, all became templates for future procedure. Agents in training studied the Lindbergh file as if it were scripture, memorizing its chronology, line by line. For Hoover, the case had turned chaos into order, proving that the federal system could master even the most elusive crime. In the years that followed, the case's influence reached far beyond its tragedy. The Federal Kidnapping Act of 19 passed in direct response to the crime, transformed jurisdiction forever. No longer could a criminal escape by crossing state lines. The law gave the Bureau authority that would extend into every corner of the United States. What began with a ransom note under a nursery window evolved into the blueprint for a national police power. For Hoover, it was both justification and legacy. The Lindbergh Law became the foundation upon which federal reach was built. Within forensic science, the case became an inflection point. The wood grain comparison performed by Arthur Kohler established the credibility of physical material analysis in court. The ransom note examination standardized handwriting identification. Currency tracing by serial number became an essential tool of financial investigation. Each technique developed during the hunt for one child became a permanent instrument of law enforcement. By the late 1930s, laboratories across the country modeled their methods on the procedures refined during the Lindbergh investigation. The case had not only solved a crime, it had created a discipline. Public fascination, however, did not fade. Books, films, and serialized accounts turned the kidnapping into legend. The phrase "crime of the century" entered common speech. Each retelling reshaped the story to fit its time. The 1930s saw it as proof of science's power. The 1950s as a warning about hysteria. The later decades as a parable about justice and doubt. The image of the ladder against the window, the ransom note with its awkward handwriting, the aviator's silent grief, all became enduring symbols. In this process of retelling, the real child, the real investigation, and the real grief blurred into myth. By the 1940s, as war consumed the world, the Lindbergh case receded into the background of national memory. Yet its consequences remained visible in every corner of American life. The FBI's growing authority, the spread of forensic laboratories, and the culture of procedural precision all traced their lineage back to Hopewell. Even the public's expectation that no crime was unsolvable came from those years of relentless pursuit. The promise of modern investigation, that truth could be engineered through evidence, was born in the wake of a broken ladder and a child's empty crib. In the archives of Washington and Trenton, the documents rested under lock and key. Thousands of pages, photographs, and samples preserved as if awaiting a new audience. The ladder, dismantled but intact, lay in storage. The ransom notes, sealed in glassine envelopes, retained their faint pencil lines. The handwriting experts who once filled courtrooms with charts and magnifiers had long since died, but their work remained frozen in the file drawers, unchanged, unchallenged, quietly permanent. Scholars who visited the archives decades later would describe the experience as standing in the presence of history's laboratory, where tragedy had been dissected into evidence and evidence into legend. The controversy did not die even with time. Journalists in later years uncovered conflicting testimonies, missing evidence, and rumors of suppressed reports. None altered the official conclusion, but each added texture to the enduring question of whether the truth had been wholly known. The case became less about guilt and more about what a society demands from certainty. In that sense, the story transcended its crime. It became a mirror of America's faith in reason, its hunger for closure, and its unease with ambiguity. For law enforcement, the Lindbergh case was the origin of modern procedure. For historians, it became the first national trial by media. For the public, it remained a ghost story about innocence lost and order restored. Each generation rediscovered it through new eyes. In classrooms, the case illustrated forensic innovation. In documentaries, it demonstrated hysteria. In literature, it symbolized the limits of progress. No other crime of its time left such a mark on so many fields. As decades passed, those who had lived the events faded away. The farmhouse at Hopewell changed hands. The courthouse in Flemington returned to routine, and the world that had once watched every headline moved on. Yet the echoes remained in the structure of federal law, in the techniques of investigation, in the mythology of American crime. What had begun as an act of violence against a child had reshaped the boundaries of the state itself. In the final measure, the Lindbergh case became both triumph and warning. It proved that science could reveal hidden truth, but also that truth, once declared, could become immutable, whether or not it was complete. It taught investigators that evidence endures longer than memory, and it taught the public that justice, once performed on a national stage, never fully ends. In the quiet rooms of the archives, where the files still rest under fluorescent light, one can trace the outline of a ladder drawn in pencil, the faint indentation of a signature, the record of every dollar bill traced across the nation. Each line, each number, each photograph carries the same underlying story. A single moment in 1932, when a crime shattered a nation and rebuilt its understanding of justice. The sound of the child's absence echoes through those pages still, a reminder that behind every investigation lies something irretrievable, something that evidence can describe, but never replace. And so the record closes. Not with resolution, but with endurance. The Lindbergh kidnapping remains, where history placed it, between certainty and doubt, between progress and loss. Its legacy lives in the laws that followed, the institutions it shaped, and the silence it left behind. Long after the witnesses died, after the files turned yellow, and the photographs began to fade, the case continued to speak, not through headlines or verdicts, but through the structures of justice it created. The field outside Hopewell is quiet now. The wind moves through the trees, as it did that March night, indifferent to what the world remembers. Yet beneath the soil, beneath the history, lies the origin of a modern belief that no crime is beyond reach, that truth can be built piece by piece, and that the price of such faith is the weight of its own certainty. Like, share, and subscribe to stay with the mystery crime for new cases.